"And it's just a toy," he said, until he saw what it could do. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The October rain drummed against the windows of the Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, as David Martinez climbed the creaking stairs to the attic for the third time that week. His grandmother's estate had been sitting untouched for 6 months since her funeral, and the weight of sorting through 73 years of accumulated memories felt heavier than the boxes themselves. The musty smell of old wood and forgotten time filled his nostrils as he pushed open the attic door, letting the pale afternoon light filter through the dusty window. "Just get through today," he muttered to himself, the same mantra he'd been repeating since Elena's death 2 years ago. His wife's absence still felt like a physical ache, and being surrounded by his grandmother's belongings only intensified the hollow feeling in his chest. At 42, David had learned that grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you learned to carry, like a stone in your pocket that you forgot about until you reached for your keys. He methodically worked through box after box, finding the usual treasures of a long life: photo albums with cracked leather covers, letters tied with faded ribbon, china patterns that had seen better decades. His grandmother, Rosa, had been a collector, someone who believed every object held a story worth preserving. It was a trait that had driven his practical father crazy, but one that David had secretly admired, especially now that she was gone. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a trunk full of winter coats that smelled of mothballs and memories, David spotted something that made him pause. It was a small wooden toy robot, no bigger than his palm, painted in bright red and blue that had faded to gentle pastels over the years. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Tiny gears were visible through a clear plastic panel on its chest, and its arms and legs moved with surprising smoothness when he picked it up. "It's just a toy," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty attic. He almost laughed at himself for being drawn to it. Here he was, a grown man who taught high school mathematics, fascinated by what was obviously a child's plaything from decades past. But something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. The weight of it in his hands, the way the late afternoon light caught the worn paint. It stirred something deep in his memory that he couldn't quite grasp. On the back of the robot, carved in tiny letters, were the initials DM and ER. His breath caught. David Martinez and Elena Rodriguez. How could this be? His grandmother had never mentioned making anything for them, and Elena had never spoken of receiving such a gift. They'd been married for 15 years before the cancer took her, and he thought he'd known every meaningful object in their shared life. As he turned the toy over in his hands, his fingers found a small switch hidden beneath one of the robot's arms. The mechanism felt delicate but functional, as if it had been recently maintained, despite its obvious age. David's grandmother had been full of surprises. He'd discovered love letters from 3 different men, a recipe collection that spanned 5 decades, and enough mystery novels to stock a small library. Perhaps this was just another of her secrets, another piece of the puzzle that was Rosa Martinez. The rain intensified outside, creating a steady rhythm against the roof that matched his heartbeat. David found himself reluctant to leave the attic, reluctant to pack away this unexpected discovery with the rest of his grandmother's things. Instead, he settled into the old rocking chair by the window, the one where Rosa used to sit and watch the neighborhood children play in the street below. He examined the robot more closely in the better light. The detail work was extraordinary. Tiny bolts that actually turned, miniature pistons that moved when he manipulated the limbs, even what appeared to be a small speaker grill in the chest area near the gears. This wasn't mass-produced. Someone had spent considerable time and skill creating this piece, investing it with a level of care that suggested deep meaning. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the attic floor, David felt a pull he couldn't explain. His rational mind, the same mind that had spent 20 years teaching teenagers the logic of mathematics, told him it was just a well-crafted toy. But his heart, the part of him that still ached for Elena's laugh and missed his grandmother's stories, whispered that there might be more to discover. His finger hovered over the small switch, hesitating. There was something almost sacred about the moment, as if he stood on the threshold between his ordinary world and something else entirely. The rain continued its steady percussion, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the evening commuter train pulling into Salem Station, carrying people home to their families and their own collections of meaningful objects. David took a deep breath, tasting dust and memory and possibility. Tomorrow he would have to return to his empty apartment in Boston, to his classroom full of distracted teenagers, to the routine that had kept him functional since Elena's death. But tonight, in his grandmother's attic with the rain as witness, he could allow himself a moment of curiosity, a moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, this small wooden robot held something worth discovering. His thumb found the switch and pressed gently. The soft click seemed to echo through the attic like a key turning in a lock, and David Martinez unknowingly stepped across a threshold from which there would be no return. At Chapter 2, the first message. The soft whirring sound that emanated from the robot made David's heart skip. The toy came alive in his hands with a gentle vibration, and the gears visible through the chest panel began to turn with purposeful precision. A small LED light he hadn't noticed before began to glow warm amber behind the plastic, casting tiny shadows that danced across his fingers. This was no ordinary vintage toy. The mechanisms were too sophisticated, too smooth, too intentionally designed. "Incredible," he whispered, watching the miniature pistons pump in a rhythm that seemed almost organic. His high school physics knowledge kicked in, and he found himself marveling at the engineering. The gears appeared to be made of real brass, and the motor was nearly silent, despite what must have been considerable power for such a small device. Rosa had always been full of surprises, but this level of craftsmanship suggested connections he'd never known she possessed. After 30 seconds of mechanical symphony, the robot's movements settled into a slower, more deliberate pattern. The amber light pulsed 3 times, then began to project something David's rational mind struggled to accept. Tiny holographic numbers appeared in the air above the robot's head. Coordinates, he realized with a start. His years of teaching mathematics made the pattern immediately recognizable. Latitude and longitude, precise to 4 decimal places. The coordinates hovered in the dim attic light for exactly 60 seconds before fading, but David had already committed them to memory. His smartphone confirmed what he'd suspected. The location was barely 3 miles from his current position, in the historic Chestnut Street Cemetery, where many of Salem's oldest families rested. His pulse quickened as he realized the implications. Someone had programmed this device to guide him to a specific location, and given the initials carved on the back, that someone had known both him and Elena well enough to create something extraordinarily personal. As if responding to his thoughts, the robot's chest panel began to glow brighter, and the speaker grill he'd noticed earlier crackled to life. Static filled the attic for several seconds, then cleared to reveal something that made David's hands tremble. Elena's voice, unmistakably warm and alive, speaking words he'd never heard before. "David, mi amor, if you're hearing this," then Rosa kept her promise. The voice was exactly as he remembered, slightly accented from her childhood in Puerto Rico, carrying the gentle humor that had made him fall in love with her in graduate school. "I know this must seem impossible, but I recorded these messages during my last weeks. I wanted to leave you something more than just memories, something that could help you heal when you were ready." Tears he'd been holding back for 2 years began to flow freely down his cheeks. David clutched the robot against his chest, afraid that if he moved too suddenly, the impossible gift would disappear. Elena's voice continued, each word a balm to wounds that had never properly healed. "Rosa told me about this toy when we visited her last Christmas. She said her father made it in Cuba before the revolution, but she'd modified it over the years, learning electronics from a friend who worked at MIT. She said it could hold messages, memories, things that mattered too much to lose." Elena paused, and David could hear the slight wheeze that had marked her final months. the sound that had kept him awake nights, listening to make sure she was still breathing. "I know you, David. I know you're probably thinking this is impossible, that you're losing your mind with grief, but you're not crazy, mi corazon. You're just discovering that love finds ways to persist that science hasn't figured out yet." The robot's gears shifted into a different pattern, and Elena's voice took on the teasing tone she'd used when she wanted him to pay attention to something important. "The coordinates you just saw will take you to Section 12 of Chestnut Street Cemetery. Rosa's buried there now, 3 rows behind the old maple tree. But that's not why you need to go. There's something buried there that I left for you, something I finished just before I got too sick to work." David's mind raced. Elena had been a jewelry designer, someone who worked with her hands the way he worked with numbers, precisely, lovingly, creating beauty from raw materials. In her final months, when the chemotherapy had stolen her energy but not her creativity, she'd spent hours in her studio working on what she'd called her final collection. He'd assumed those pieces had been sold with the rest of her equipment to help pay for medical bills. "I buried a small waterproof box 18 inches down, marked with a stone that has our initials. Inside, you'll find the last thing I made for you, David. But more than that, you'll find instructions for the robot. Rosa taught me how to program it with more than just voice messages. It can hold videos, documents, even interactive elements that respond to voice commands." The amber light began to pulse more rapidly, and Elena's voice grew softer, more intimate. "This isn't about clinging to the past, mi amor. It's about giving you tools for the future. I recorded enough content to last you a year of weekly messages, each one unlocked by solving puzzles I designed around our shared memories. Rosa said the robot would know when you were ready for each new message based on how you interacted with it." Static began to creep back into the transmission, and Elena's voice started to fade. "Go to the cemetery tomorrow, David. Find what I left for you. And remember, this isn't goodbye, it's just a different way of staying close." The robot powered down as gently as it had awakened, the gears slowing to a stop and the amber light fading to darkness. David sat in the growing twilight of the attic, holding the silent device and trying to process what had just occurred. His rational mind catalogued impossibilities: holographic projection from a device that appeared to be decades old, voice recordings with perfect clarity, programming sophisticated enough to respond to environmental cues. But his heart, the part of him that had loved Elena Rodriguez since they were 24 years old, whispered a different truth. Love, real love, didn't follow the rules of physics or logic. It found ways to persist, to reach across impossible distances, to offer comfort when comfort seemed impossible. Outside, the October rain had gentled to a soft mist, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on throughout Salem's historic neighborhoods. David could see families gathering for dinner in the houses below, their lit windows creating a constellation of ordinary happiness that he'd once taken for granted. Tomorrow, he would drive to Chestnut Street Cemetery. Tomorrow, he would search for a stone marked with their initials and dig 18 inches down into New England soil. Tomorrow, he would discover what Elena Rodriguez had left for the husband she'd loved enough to defy death itself. Tonight, however, he simply sat with the silent robot in his hands and whispered "thank you" to the grandmother he'd never properly appreciated, and the wife whose love had proven stronger than the grave. Chapter 3. The Cemetery Discovery. Dawn broke grey and misty over Salem as David drove through the empty streets toward Chestnut Street Cemetery, the robot wrapped carefully in a towel on the passenger seat beside him. He'd barely slept, torn between anticipation and the fear that yesterday's experience had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But the device was real enough, solid and warm in his hands, and the memory of Elena's voice remained crystal clear in his mind. The cemetery gates stood open, wreathed in morning fog that made the weathered headstones look like ships emerging from a grey sea. David had visited this place only once before for his grandmother's funeral 6 months ago, but Elena's directions proved accurate. Section 12 lay beyond the old maple tree, its ancient branches now bare except for a few stubborn leaves that clung desperately to the October wind. He found Rosa's grave easily. The granite marker was still sharp-edged and new compared to its weathered neighbors. Rosa Elena Martinez, 1948 to 2024, beloved grandmother and keeper of stories. David knelt beside the headstone, running his fingers over the engraved letters as guilt washed over him. He'd been so consumed with his own grief that he'd barely mourned the woman who'd raised his father, who'd sent him birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside well into his 30s, who'd apparently conspired with his dying wife to create an impossible gift of love. 3 rows behind, he murmured, counting off the graves until he found what Elena had described. The stone was small and worn, dating back to the 1890s, but someone had recently placed 2 smooth river rocks on top of it, each carved with a single initial, D and E. David's hands shook as he moved the markers aside and began to dig with the small garden spade he'd brought from his grandmother's shed. The New England soil was soft from the previous night's rain, and 18 inches down, his spade struck something solid. The waterproof box Elena had mentioned was larger than he'd expected, roughly the size of a shoebox made of military-grade plastic that showed no signs of age, despite having been buried for over 2 years. Inside, nestled in foam padding like precious artifacts, David found treasures that took his breath away. The first item was a ring unlike anything in Elena's previous work. She'd crafted it from white gold and set it with a small but perfectly clear diamond that caught even the weak morning light and threw tiny rainbows across his palm. But the truly remarkable feature was the band itself. She'd somehow embedded microcircuits into the metal, creating patterns that looked like decorative engravings but were clearly functional electronics. A small card in Elena's handwriting explained, "Wear this always." It communicates with the robot and unlocks new messages based on your emotional state and location. Rosa helped me design the biometric sensors. The second item made him laugh despite his tears. A leather notebook filled with Elena's precise handwriting, titled Operating Manual for Impossible Things. She'd documented everything: the robot's history, its programming, the technology Rosa had helped her integrate, and most importantly, a schedule of the 52 weekly messages she'd recorded, each one designed to unlock specific memories and help him heal incrementally. The robot responds to voice commands in Spanish or English, she'd written, but more than that, it learns. The AI subroutines Rosa programmed will adapt its responses based on your interactions. It's not just playing back recordings, David. It's having conversations with you, using everything I told it about who you are and who I hope you'll become. At the bottom of the box, David found a small digital tablet, its screen protected by a note that made his heart race. "When you're ready, not today, probably not next week, but someday when the loneliness feels manageable, turn this on. I recorded video messages too, but promise me you'll use the robot's weekly audio messages first. I need you to heal gradually, mi amor. I need you to learn to live again before you see my face." David sat back on his heels in the damp cemetery grass, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Elena had created. This wasn't just a collection of recordings. It was an interactive memorial, a way for her to continue loving him actively rather than just existing in his memories. The technology involved was staggering, requiring knowledge of electronics, programming, and artificial intelligence that neither Elena nor Rosa should have possessed. As if summoned by his thoughts, the robot in his jacket pocket began to vibrate gently. David pulled it out and watched as the amber light pulsed 3 times, then projected new coordinates into the misty air above the cemetery. These numbers led to a location in downtown Salem, and the street address made him smile despite everything: the public library where he and Eleanor had spent countless Saturday mornings during their early years together. Eleanor's voice emerged from the speaker, clearer than yesterday, as if the robot's systems were learning to optimize themselves. "You found everything, didn't you? I can tell because the ring is now within 5 feet of the robot, and its sensors are detecting elevated heart rate and stress hormones. Don't worry, I'm not spying on you. I just wanted the system to be smart enough to help you when you need it most. David slipped the ring onto his finger, surprised by how perfectly it fit. Elena had always been good at details, but this level of precision suggested she'd somehow measured his finger without him knowing. The band felt warm against his skin, and he could feel the slight hum of electronic activity. The library coordinates will take you to the reference desk where Mrs. Patterson works. Do you remember her? She helped us research genealogy for your family tree project in 2018. I've been corresponding with her for months, and she's holding something else for you. Think of it as technical support for impossible love. Static began to interfere with the transmission, but Elena's voice pushed through with obvious effort. David, I need you to understand something. This isn't about keeping me alive in some artificial way. It's about giving you permission to live fully while still carrying our love with you. The robot will guide you through 52 weeks of healing, but then it's designed to power down permanently. By then, you'll be strong enough to love again, maybe differently, but just as deeply. The message ended abruptly, leaving David alone among the weathered headstones with rain beginning to fall again. He carefully reburied the empty box, replacing the stones on the old grave marker, and walked back toward his car, carrying Elena's impossible gifts. The ring pulsed gently against his finger in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the robot remained warm in his pocket like a living thing. As he drove toward the Salem Public Library through streets that were beginning to fill with normal people living normal lives, David realized that Eleanor had given him something more precious than mere recordings. She'd given him a structured path through grief, a year-long journey with a loving guide who knew him better than he knew himself. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time since Elena's death, uncertain didn't feel the same as hopeless. In Chapter 4, The Living Memorial. Mrs. Patterson looked exactly as David remembered. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by the comforting chaos of the reference desk that had been her domain for over 30 years. Her face lit up with recognition when she saw him approaching, but there was something else in her expression too, a mixture of sympathy and barely contained excitement that made David's pulse quicken. "David Martinez," she said warmly, standing to embrace him. "Elena told me you'd come, though she said it might take you a while to work up the courage. I have something for you that I think will change everything you thought you knew about what's possible." She led him to a private study room behind the main desk, where a large cardboard box sat waiting on the table. Unlike the waterproof container from the cemetery, this box was clearly old, its corners reinforced with tape that had yellowed with age. When Mrs. Patterson opened it, David saw layers of documents, photographs, and electronic components that looked like they belonged in a museum of computing history. "Your wife and grandmother weren't the first to work on this project," Mrs. Patterson explained, settling into the chair across from him. What you're holding is the result of a collaboration that spans 3 generations of women who understood that love and loss require innovative solutions." The photographs at the top of the pile made David's breath catch. Black and white images from the 1950s showed Rosa as a young woman working alongside an older man in what appeared to be an electronics workshop. The man's face was familiar in a way David couldn't place until he saw the signature on the back of one photo. Miguel Santos, MIT Research Fellow, 1952. Santos, Elena's grandfather, the man she'd mentioned only in passing as someone who'd worked with early computers before anyone really knew what computers could become. Miguel Santos developed the core technology in the 1950s, Mrs. Patterson continued, but he died before he could perfect it. Rosa and Elena spent 15 years refining his work, using advances in miniaturization and artificial intelligence that he could never have imagined. What you have in that robot represents the culmination of 70 years of research into what Elena called persistent love technologies. David found himself laughing, a sound that seemed out of place in the quiet library room. Persistent love technologies? That sounds like something from a science fiction novel. Does it? Mrs. Patterson smiled. Or does it sound like exactly what someone would call the intersection of advanced computing and the human heart? Elena showed me the technical specifications, David. That robot contains processing power equivalent to a modern smartphone, voice recognition software that can detect emotional states through vocal patterns, and biometric sensors sophisticated enough to monitor stress hormones through skin contact. It's not magic. It's engineering applied to love. The documents in the box told a story that reframed everything David thought he understood about his family. Rosa hadn't been just a retired seamstress who collected vintage objects. She'd been an autodidact engineer who'd spent decades learning electronics, programming, and artificial intelligence from library books and correspondence courses. Elena hadn't been simply a jewelry designer. She'd been a woman who'd combined artistic sensibilities with technical knowledge inherited from her grandfather and refined through collaboration with Rosa. They worked on this for 3 years, Mrs. Patterson explained. Ever since Elena's diagnosis, she said she needed to create something that could love you actively, not just passively. Something that could grow and change and help you heal in ways that static recordings never could. At the bottom of the box, David found a technical manual that made his head spin. The robot's systems were more complex than he'd imagined, incorporating machine learning algorithms that adapted to his responses, GPS tracking that triggered location-specific messages, and even connections to local databases that could provide contextually relevant information about places and events that had mattered to his relationship with Elena. She programmed it with everything, Mrs. Patterson said softly. Every story you told her about your childhood, every inside joke, every place you visited together, every dream you shared for the future. The robot doesn't just play back recordings, it synthesizes Elena's voice and personality to have conversations she never actually recorded, using what she called predictive love modeling. David stared at the manual, trying to process the implications. You're saying the robot can think like Elena? Respond to situations she never anticipated? Within limits, yes. She spent months training the AI system with recordings of her thoughts on hundreds of hypothetical scenarios. She wanted it to be able to comfort you through situations she couldn't predict, to help you make decisions using her values and perspectives, even for choices she'd never considered. The ring on David's finger began to pulse more rapidly, and the robot in his pocket activated without being touched. Elena's voice filled the small study room, but this time it sounded spontaneous, rather than pre-recorded, responding to conversations she couldn't have known would happen. David, mi amor, you're learning the truth faster than I expected. Mrs. Patterson, thank you for keeping our secret safe. There was a pause, as if the system was processing real-time audio from the room. I know this seems impossible, but remember what I always told you about love. It doesn't follow rules. It makes its own rules. Mrs. Patterson smiled and spoke directly to the robot. Hello, Elena, how is he doing? Confused but hopeful, came the immediate reply. His stress levels are high but manageable, and the biometric data from the ring suggests he's ready for the next phase of his healing journey. David, there's something else you need to know. The robot isn't designed to replace human connection, it's designed to prepare you for it. David found his voice at last. What do you mean? I mean that in 6 months, when you've worked through half the weekly messages, the system will start encouraging you to engage with the world again. It will suggest activities, places to visit, even people to meet. I programmed it with profiles of women in your area who share your interests and values, not because I want you to forget me, but because I want you to remember what it feels like to love someone who can love you back. The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the library's heating system. David looked at Mrs. Patterson, who was smiling through tears of her own. "She asked me to tell you something else," the librarian said. "The robot will work for exactly 52 weeks. On the first anniversary of you finding it, it will deliver one final message and then power down permanently." Elena said she didn't want to create a crutch. She wanted to create a bridge. David stood and walked to the window overlooking Salem's busy downtown streets. People hurried past on their lunch breaks, living normal lives filled with ordinary problems and everyday joys. For 2 years, he'd felt separated from that world by an invisible wall of grief. But now, with Elena's impossible gift pulsing gently against his finger and her voice speaking to him across the boundaries of death itself, the wall seemed less solid, more permeable. "She really thought of everything, didn't she?" he said finally. "She loved you enough to engineer a year of healing," Mrs. Patterson replied. "And she trusted you enough to believe that when the year was over, you'd be strong enough to build a new life while still carrying the best parts of your old one." David turned back to face the room, his hand instinctively moving to the robot in his pocket. Eleanor's voice emerged one more time, soft and intimate. "Go home, David. Rest. Tomorrow is Wednesday, which means it's time for your first weekly message. I have so much to tell you about learning to live again, about the difference between mourning and remembering, about all the ways love persists, even when bodies fail. This is just the beginning, mi corazón. We have work to do together." Nice. As David walked out of the Salem Public Library into the crisp October afternoon, he realized that Elena had given him something more precious than memories, or even the sophisticated technology that made her continued presence possible. She had given him permission to heal without forgetting, to love again without betraying, to carry her with him into whatever future awaited while still being fully present for that future when it arrived. The robot in his pocket hummed softly in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the ring on his finger pulsed with gentle warmth. 51 weeks stretched ahead of him, 51 conversations with the woman who had loved him enough to defy death itself, 51 steps along the path from grief toward whatever came next. For the first time since Elena's death, David Martinez walked toward home with hope outweighing sorrow, carrying impossible love in his pocket and the promise of healing on his finger.